Hey, good evening. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Gadi Schwartz coming to you from Los Angeles. And there is one story that is dominating all the headlines tonight, and that is Donald Trump's court appearance. Today, he became the first former president ever to be arraigned for federal crimes, pleading not guilty to 37 counts. And that led to a full-on spectacle that included a protester running in front of Trump's motorcade and a stop at a nearby Cuban restaurant where there was a spontaneous early birthday celebration for the former president. There were relatively few words coming from Republican leaders on Capitol Hill.
I'm just simply not going to comment on the candidates. We've got a bunch of them, and I'm just simply going to stay out of it.
Next up, for the former president, setting the stage for his speech tonight at his golf course in New Jersey, followed by a candlelight dinner all hours after he was fingerprinted and booked in federal court. And from Florida to New Jersey, former President Donald Trump going from being booked, fingerprinted, arraigned, and released today in Miami to making that campaign stop on his way to the airport to retreating to his private club in Bedminster. It has been a whirlwind of a day, the likes of which we have never seen. And we're going to get into all of that, from what happened when what looked like an anti-Trump protester jumped in front of the motorcade to the very latest tonight, where the embattled former president is set to speak. But let's start with what happened in Miami during his first court appearance in federal court over these 37 counts he's facing in this mishandling of classified documents case. And this is the second time in 2 months where he was technically booked and his fingerprints were taken. There was no mugshot this time or last, but a court sketch artist was in the room documenting the moments Donald Trump appeared before a judge. And that's a judge he appointed. He was read those charges against him. His lawyer, Todd Blanche, pled not guilty on his behalf. And outside, things were starting to get a bit chaotic. Trump supporters facing off with a few anti-Trump protesters outside the courthouse. And as soon as the motorcade carrying Trump left the courthouse, one apparent anti-Trump protester wearing a prisoner's costume and carrying a sign that said, "Lock him up," ran into the middle of the road, blocking the SUVs, and was quickly taken down. Once cleared, the motorcade made a surprise stop at a coffee shop on the way to the airport. And this isn't just any coffee shop. This is Café Versailles, a well-known campaign stop when courting Latino voters. And inside, supporters surrounded the former president and even started singing him happy birthday, which is tomorrow. Trump then sharing thoughts about the day.
I think it's a rigged deal here. We have a rigged country. We have a country that's corrupt. We have a country that's got no borders. We have a country that's got nothing but problems. We're a nation in decline, and then they do this stuff.
NBC News correspondent Gabe Gutierrez joins us now from Miami. Gabe, a pretty surreal day out there. That protesters rushing the motorcade, the pit stop on the way to the airport. It's wild because there are two things happening today, the political spectacle and the legal proceedings. But let's start with what everyone's talking about, and that's what we saw outside of the courthouse. Was it as chaotic as it looks on TV?
Well, there, Gadi, the word you use is very appropriate. It was a spectacle, both legally and politically. Let's start with what happened outside the courthouse. Now, local authorities here in Miami had been preparing for potentially thousands of people to show up here outside of the federal courthouse in downtown Miami. That did not happen, but there were several hundred people here, and at times it was a turbulent scene, but thankfully not much of a security threat. There was that one instance of that demonstrator going out in front of the former president's motorcade, but overall it was just it was a surreal atmosphere, as you mentioned. The former president of the United States coming here to the courthouse behind me to face those federal charges for the first time in history, Gadi. It was surreal to witness, and yes, it was just it was a remarkable thing to see both outside the courthouse and also inside, Gadi.
And now to what happened inside of the courthouse. I know you were inside watching it all go down in that overflow room. What was Trump's reaction when they read those charges?
All right, and just for our viewers, the courtroom had there were so many reporters there and also some members of the public, so they had to limit how many people could actually go into the actual courtroom. I was in the overflow room that allowed me to go out early and report some of what happened inside to our viewers. It was incredible, though, to see through a video feed the former president of the United States there at the defense table, sitting just feet from his alleged co-conspirator in this case, Walter Nada, who is his body man. He's also flanked on either side, the former president, by his attorneys. His attorney Todd Blanche, a well-known white-collar defense attorney from New York, and also his South Florida co-counsel, and to hear one of his attorneys say on his behalf, not guilty. Gadi, that was just incredible. And also to hear the magistrate judge in this case refer to the people of the United States versus Donald J. Trump in this sweeping 37-count indictment against the former president. Taking a step back, just think of how incredible that is. A federal indictment against a former president. Just remarkable.
Did you get a sense of his demeanor in there?
The former president did not say one word during this court appearance, which, by the way, was 47 minutes. I had one of my colleagues who was in the room, Garrett Haig, who said that he did not even see the former president turn back around at all. But if he would have done so, he would have seen the special counsel, Jack Smith, who was in the first row behind the prosecution's table. And just think of how incredible that in and of itself is. A special counsel brought in to oversee the prosecution of this case. He was sitting there as this arraignment moved forward. Again, a magistrate judge oversaw this portion of the case. The former president pleaded not guilty through his attorney. Walter Nada, though, the alleged co-conspirator here, Gadi, he did not enter a plea today. That's because while he did have counsel with him, that counsel was not based on South Florida. So he's due back here, excuse me, at the end of this month to enter a formal plea, Gadi.
And Gabe, as part of most arraignments, the judge sets parameters for what is allowed, what is not allowed. As this case goes forward, what happened in this particular arraignment?
Right, and there was a lot of discussion today. It actually made up the bulk of this hearing, this debate over who the former president could speak with here. In many cases like this, the defendant would not be allowed to speak to anybody, any potential witnesses in the case. But right now, there hasn't been a clear witness list put forward by prosecutors. Also, Walt Nada works for the former president. He works very closely with him. He's a closely trusted aide and his body man. So there was discussion about whether he'd be able to speak with them. What the judge ended up saying was that the former president could not speak about the case to any of his employees or potential witnesses here. But again, that was discussed at length and will probably continue to be discussed at length as this case moves forward, Gadi.
And Gabe, we're looking at two timelines. One, the court docket, another, the presidential election. Actually, two court dockets and the presidential election. How are those going to overlap here?
Well, there are still some questions about the timeline for this particular case, but I can tell you, Gadi, the other case that the former President Trump is facing alleged hush money payments in Lower Manhattan. That case potentially could head to trial by March of next year. Of course, that runs right into the height of the presidential campaign season, the primary season. So that is something to consider. In this case, yes, it is possible that this case could head to trial, perhaps, next year as the presidential campaign is still underway. And so that is still being worked out, but it is lost on no one, and especially Donald Trump, who right after leaving this courthouse, as you mentioned, went to Cafe Versailles here in Miami and treated it essentially as a campaign stop and had those supporters singing happy birthday to him as he remained defiant. So this cannot be separated. The legal implications of this cannot be separated from the political implications of this. And we've also, heard new reaction from several of the other GOP candidates in this race. Mike Pence just writing an op-ed that published just a few minutes ago. Nikki Haley offering new comments today, suggesting that she would be inclined to pardon former President Trump, even though she's still calling his actions reckless. This is so unprecedented in so many ways legally, but also we've never dealt with a political campaign quite like this one. Gadi.
Gabe, thanks so much. Your reporting today has been incredible. Thanks. And again, this is the second indictment for Donald Trump and one of several investigations ongoing into the former president that are happening across the country right now. In April, Trump was charged in Manhattan for his role in what prosecutors call a hush money scheme to pay off adult film star Stormy Daniels back in 2016. Meanwhile, a Georgia prosecutor is investigating Trump's attempts to reverse the 2020 election results in that state. And those cases are in addition to the January 6 inquiries and a civil case, which he has already been found liable for. But how did we get here? And at this point of the classified documents probe, Hallie Jackson is going to take us back to the beginning of the investigation, which began in the early days of the post-Trump presidency.
It starts just after the former president moved out of the White House in 2021 with boxes of classified documents stacked on a stage at Mar-a-Lago, according to the indictment. Some then moved to a bathroom. Around this time, the National Archives demands some of the classified documents from the Trump presidency they're supposed to have but don't. Then a key moment that summer. The indictment says Mr. Trump allegedly showed a writer a document laying out a plan of attack, citing a recording. And Mr. Trump says, as president, I could have declassified it. Now I can't, but this is still a secret. Fast forward about 6 months later, Mr. Trump's personal valet and alleged co-conspirator, Walt Nauta, returns 15 boxes of classified documents to the archives, according to the indictment. But that didn't stop the FBI from opening a criminal investigation. A month later, a D.C. grand jury came together. In June, a couple FBI agents and a DOJ attorney went down to South Florida and got a signed letter from Mr. Trump's attorneys saying, essentially, they'd turned over everything they had. That turned out not to be true because in August, the FBI carried out a search warrant at Mar-a-Lago and releasing this picture of documents laid out on the floor, something Mr. Trump didn't like seeing.
The shameful raid and break-in of my home, Mar-a-Lago, was a travesty of justice.
Attorney General Merrick Garland named a special counsel to lead the investigation in November.
I signed an order appointing Jack Smith to serve as special counsel.
Now there's Jack Smith, tasked with looking at the January 6th attack and the classified documents case. Mr. Trump, now officially running to win back the White House, furious.
I took the documents. I'm allowed to. I have the absolute right to do whatever I want with them.
Over the course of the next 6 months or so, the special counsel issuing subpoenas and hearing from a lot of people in Mr. Trump's orbit, all leading up to last week when the Department of Justice unsealed the indictment, revealing those 37 felony counts against the former president.
We have one set of laws in this country, and they apply to everyone.
That was Hallie Jackson reporting. Let's bring in our legal panel, NBC legal analyst Danny Savallo, Cynthia Oxney. Cynthia, Danny, welcome to you both. Let's start with your reactions to what happened today. Cynthia, I'll start with you.
Well, I was only disappointed that we didn't get a window into the timeline. And we didn't because there isn't a scheduling order that's been issued. And that was because we didn't have Judge Cannon's magistrate. We had a general magistrate. So there was nothing, surreptitious about that. It just happens to be the way it worked today. That was the only disappointing thing. I mean, it was predictable. There are arraignments all over this country, thousands of them every day. And it seemed to, with a couple of exceptions, but not big ones, it really just kind of followed the normal process, which is the way it should be, because everybody should be treated the same under the law.
And Danny, it seemed like everything inside went procedurally as planned, although there was some shuffling of his legal defense. When you see that, what do you see?
I think too much has been made of this whole Trump couldn't find a lawyer. First of all, it's an arraignment. Virtually anybody can stand in. He has other lawyers, lawyers that practice in federal court that are very able and could certainly pro hoc. And I understand they did pro hoc, and pro hoc is a Latin term that means basically just come into that court. They may not be formally admitted, but they're admitted just for this particular case. So, yeah, I mean, it's significant that Trump hasn't found lawyers yet, but not damaging. Anyone could have stood in today, but he does need to find counsel that is going to handle this case going forward, because he's going to need more than just an attorney. He's going to need a team. There are going to be terabytes of documents, thousands, if not maybe even millions of pages, files, all kinds of things that a team needs to go through. At this point, the government is probably ready to go to trial. It's the defense's turn. They have to play catch up. So this is that formal kickoff. This is the starting of the clock. And while we won't see a lot will happen under the surface as the defense team gets discovery, prepares discovery, starts moving forward towards trial, inexorably towards trial. Maybe not by the end of this year, maybe sometime next year, but sooner or later, they're going to trial.
And Cynthia, a lot of people are asking why no mugshot, not in Miami, not in the New York case. Can you explain that?
Well, I think they're doing it just because it's, he's a former president, and they had the whole purpose of a mugshot, is so you can find them later if they don't show up. Okay, everybody knows who this guy is. I don't think that's so much of a big deal as, the manner in which we deal with the defenses and how we get this case moving toward trial. I would just say this next time, starting right now, starting today, until the beginning of the trial is the most important part of this trial. That's because that's when the motion practice is going to happen. For Trump, the entire ball game is the motion practice, because if he has to go to trial, he's going to lose. If he can get through the motion practice and get some of this evidence kicked out, he might have some kind of a shot. But everything is in the motion practice for him, because trial itself on this indictment is a conviction.
And Danny, you're a defense attorney. This is your specialty. How do you see his defense possibly mounting here?
Don't look to Trump's mouth for his defense, because he doesn't know what he's talking about. More likely, everything is going to come down to really two phases of the defense. Pretrial motions, anything and everything they can do to file a motion to throw the case out, to suppress evidence. For example, can they suppress the evidence of the attorney, of Trump's attorney, Evan Corcoran, that they were able to obtain, at least obtain it for investigative purposes? Can the defense prevent that from coming in as evidence against Trump? That would be a major victory if they could get that suppressed for whatever reason. Can they file a motion that this is selective prosecution and they're treating Trump differently than they would other defendants? I expect they will file that motion. That motion never wins, but at least they preserve the issue for appeal. So pretrial motions will be the first part. And the second part, the second phase, if they get to trial, and that means that they're in the red zone, that means they're going to have to deploy a defense that is basically, look, Trump tried to work with them, tried to work with the National Archives, tried to work with DOJ. They were both inflexible. The government was totally inflexible. And that'll fold into their overall theme of Trump as being persecuted. Now, I want to be clear. Will that work? I don't know. But the defense doesn't get to pick its facts. They got to work up a creative defense based on the facts that they have.
And Cynthia, the other person charged in this case is the valet, Trump's body man, Walt Nauta. He was at the cafe stop, and we saw him behind Trump right after this arraignment. We understand that he was at the courthouse as well, right there with Trump, possibly traveling there with him. Is the judge here restricting their communication? I mean, he works for the former president, right?
Okay. Right. So what happened at the arraignment is Walt Nauta, who's been charged along with Trump, who's got a really big problem in this indictment because he was caught lying to the FBI. And he's actually the guy who did all the dirty work and moved all the boxes and physically broke the rules for Trump. At the arraignment, because he was not arraigned because he didn't have a lawyer who was admitted to the bar in Florida. So his arraignment has been put off, but the judge did conditions of release of Trump and of him. And one of the conditions was you can't talk to each other about the case unless your lawyers are present. It isn't you can't talk to each other. The rule was you can't talk about the case without your lawyers present. Now, the obvious question is, who's going to enforce that? Who's going to believe that they don't? But that was the ruling. So today, when they went back and got in the limousine together, that was not a violation of the judge's rule. When they went to the Versailles, which I'm convinced was a totally planned stop and not something random, because it's such a famous place and because it was filled with supporters and with ministers, to pray over him. But when they went back there, that was not a violation of the judge's orders. It will only be a violation if they discuss the case not in the presence of the lawyers.
if they discuss the case, and as we saw them golfing together, or them on a golf course, or them in a car, and there's no enforcement mechanism to make sure that they do not discuss this case, right?
That's right. I mean, and here's the thing. This is sort of what's interesting. The government does not need Nauta to flip, right? Because they've done this indictment without him. They obviously have all kinds of evidence, and I'm sure they have more evidence than what's in the indictment, right? But it would be nice if he would flip, but they don't need it. Let's say he does flip, and let's say Trump has discussed the case with him. Part of that flipping will be to find that out. And then if that happens, and Nauta A flips and B says, and by the way, we discussed the case because Trump wanted to talk about it and told me not to tell anyone, now you have him violating the judge's orders. So Trump has to be careful because he doesn't really know what's going to happen with Nauta, because Nauta has every reason. He has every reason. He's going to go to jail if he doesn't flip.
And if he did that, he flips and then he says, hey, we discussed this, we violated the judge's orders, hypothetically, would that be a new federal case, or would that be folded into this one?
It would be something that the judge would handle. It probably wouldn't be a federal case. It would be some kind of punishment within the court. But here's the problem. You have to have the judge's help as you're going into trial if you're the defendant, right? The judge is in charge, and the judge controls the schedule. The judge is making all kinds of rulings, and that they control all kinds of things. What you don't want to do is make the judge mad. You don't want to make the judge not trust you any more than you're already not trusted. So it's not in his interest to make the judge mad. And all I'm saying is, because Nauta is an unknown to Trump, he needs to be careful. And because Nauta is in so much trouble, because he's done so many things that he's been caught in, he has every reason to flip. It's kind of interesting. Sometimes you think, well, the government really needs somebody, and that somebody doesn't really need to do anything. He can go to trial. Not in this case. In this case, the government does not need Nauta, and he desperately needs the government. So Trump has to be even more careful with him as he tries to hug him close to keep him under his control.
And Danny, what do we know about the judge here?
Well, judge today was a magistrate, generally not the magistrate I understand that normally works under Judge Cannon. So it's a magistrate judge today. We'll never see that judge again. That is the limited purpose that the role that the magistrate will play in this case. It's really just a staging area, and from here it moves on to Judge Cannon. Judge Cannon, of course, is a Trump appointee and will exercise a lot of control over the case. That means she'll be deciding pretrial motions. I think there's been a lot of unnecessary alarm about whether or not she'll decide everything in favor of Trump. But there are points to be made. There are certain rulings she can make that are either unreviewable or are going to be very difficult to overturn on appeal. And that includes the admission of evidence. Of course, if she suppresses evidence, that can be appealed. But for example, if she enters a ruling or she enters an order of acquittal at the end of the case, in certain circumstances, that's not reviewable at all. So in theory, even after a verdict, it's possible this judge could take the case away from a jury. I don't want to be alarmist. I'm not saying there's any indication that Judge Cannon would do that this judge would go rogue or anything like that. But federal district judges do have a lot of power, and some of their decisions are simply not reviewable.
Danny Savalos and Cynthia Oxley, thanks so very much for joining us. And we're about to hear from the former President Trump in Bedminster, New Jersey, raising a lot of questions about how this is going to play out for the GOP in 2024. And I want to bring in NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard from Bedminster, New Jersey right now. Vaughn, he's about to start speaking there. What's the mood like, and what can we expect to hear from him?
Yeah, Gadi, he's actually on the way from Newark International Airport here in New Jersey en route to his Bedminster club. There's a couple hundred folks, supporters, but also members of this private club here. And what we should expect is it's kind of a deja vu from 2.5 months ago, frankly. But instead of flying from Manhattan when he was indicted in that hush money payment case and flew down to his Mar-a-Lago club, he is now coming here to Bedminster, where he will be spending the summer months. And we should hear a defiant Donald Trump, in the words of one aide earlier today, telling me of what we should expect from his remarks today. He has been insistent that this is a witch hunt, that it's political persecution, and it is the targeting of not only a former president, but also the current front runner by a big margin for the 2024 Republican nomination, Gadi.
And Vaughn, do you think this is going to supercharge Trump's fundraising? I mean, the numbers that we saw the last time he was indicted are pretty astronomical.
I mean, we're talking about millions of dollars in fundraising, and, you know, Donald Trump has to use this to his political advantage to the extent that he can. I was just talking to one club member here who I said, you know, what led you here tonight? He goes, well, I donated. I came and supported. Donald Trump sent me an email. And if you read some of these emails that the campaign sends out, one here today in which he called it some of the darkest hours in America. You know, there's millions of Americans who are hearing Donald Trump's version of the events that led to this indictment. And of course, he has the defense in the court of law, and he and his lawyers are going to be able to make their case. But the allegations laid out in the indictment are damning. But for those that are tuning into right-wing outlets or reading Donald Trump's campaign emails, they feel like this is a political target job. And for them, they feel like it's their responsibility as conservatives, as Republicans, as Trump's supporters to help defend him not only on the legal front, but also on the political one.
And Vaughn, there are a few ways all of this could end. For one, Trump could win the presidency and pardon himself. On the other, another Republican could win and pardon former President Donald Trump as well. And we're already hearing some rumblings over the possibility from candidates like Nikki Haley. Let's take a quick listen.
I'm happy to announce this is my commitment on January 20th, 2025, if I'm elected the next U.S. president, to pardon Donald J. Trump for these offenses.
When you look at a pardon, the issue is less about guilt and more about what's good for the country. I would be inclined in favor of a pardon, but I think it's really premature at this point when he's not even been convicted of anything.
Now, Vaughn, do you think this is going to become a major reoccurring theme here in the run-up to the election?
Absolutely, Will Gadi. I mean, the stakes of this right now are absolutely wild. 7.5 months from now are when Iowans are going to go and caucus. So then over the next 7.5 months, you're looking at not only a potential number 3 or 4 indictment related to other investigations underway, but you're going to be having these candidates openly discussing whether they would pardon Donald Trump or not. In the case of, Mike Pence, he just wrote, reacted to the Wall Street Journal about the indictment, calling them serious allegations laid out. But he was concerned about the political repercussions of the Department of Justice choosing to go through with this indictment. There is a lot on the line. In the reality that Republicans, including those running for president, are working with, Gadi, is the fact that Donald Trump, since he was first arrested in the Manhattan hush money payment case, he's actually doubled his lead over Ron DeSantis in the last 2.5 months. These investigations, when talking with voters, they are not a deterrent, but more of a rallying cry for them to come and support Donald Trump as he makes the case to them that he is defending them in the MAGA or conservative movement.
And Vaughn, we've seen other candidates take a completely different tact. Chris Christie swinging for the fences on Twitter, calling Trump a loser, loser, loser. Do you think we're going to see other candidates use this as campaign ammo, or is this, like you said, a rallying cry for Republicans over what they are calling selective prosecution?
Right. Well, look, at Chris Christie, in some polls maybe has 1% support. Asa Hutchinson is the former Arkansas governor. He's also about 1 or 2% of support in the polls, and he has said that Donald Trump should drop out of the race because of that. But when you look at where those two, who have been very forceful about what is laid out in the Department of Justice's indictment, are at polling, it's clear because CBS released a poll just yesterday that showed 76% of likely Republican voters nationally believe that Donald Trump is being unfairly politically targeted. When you look at those numbers, it is clear why Nikki Haley, Tim Scott, Mike Pence, and Ron DeSantis are a little bit more hesitant to come out swinging, because for the last 8 years, they have defended Donald Trump and largely propagated this idea of the deep state and the idea of the, quote, radical left or the Department of Justice coming and attacking Donald Trump. So it's tough for them now in the year of 2023 to suddenly switch course because, as one conservative commentator put it yesterday, that Nikki Haley and Tim Scott had joined the mob, in the words. And those are really the sort of rhetoric that is being used to compel Republican voters to rally around Donald Trump as somebody who could face years in prison if he is not elected. The stakes are just really that dramatic, Gadi.
And Vaughn, there are those that listen very closely to the polls. I listen to Vaughn Hilliard. You have the pulse, or the finger right on the pulse. So I hate to put you on the spot, but based on everything that you've seen today, trending up or trending down, the former president in this race, based on what we've seen today and based on the people that you've been talking to?
Gadi, in talking with Republican voters over the last weeks, I've met some that are looking beyond Donald Trump, but not because of the investigations. And I think it's going to come down to, I think Iowa is going to be that real test in the beginning of February of next year. But as of right now, I've seen little evidence over the last months to suggest that Donald Trump's political prowess has declined. And over the course of the last weeks, despite these indictments and despite potential hearings running parallel to his campaign, I've seen little evidence from conversations with Republican voters and little data from Republican polling to suggest that he is on a downward trajectory at this point. Gadi.
Vaughn, thanks so much, brother. And we want to turn now to NBC News contributor Jonathan Atler and political strategist Amisha Cross. We're just talking a little bit about selective prosecution. Jonathan, there are the state courts, the federal courts, and then there's the court of public opinion. They all move at very different speeds. We've heard the Republicans hammer this idea of selective prosecution over and over and over again, and yet we see the legal process moving very slowly. How do you see all of this playing out as we go forward towards the next elections?
Well, the wheels of justice do grind slowly, Gadi, and it's in Donald Trump's interest for them to grind even more slowly. That's been his legal strategy for decades now, is to slow everything down. And with Judge Eileen Cannon, who has already issued several opinions right after the raid at Mar-a-Lago that favored Trump, and she's a Trump appointee, Cuban-American, very supportive of Donald Trump in the past. And so I think you can expect her to probably go along with the defense's requests to slow this down. And there are many, many documents to review. So it's quite possible that there will not be a trial before the election. Politically, I think we need to broaden the conversation from the Republican electorate, which is indeed rallying around Donald Trump, to the general election electorate, which is a very different matter. Trump is doing badly with independents. As things stand right now, he's not really in very good shape to return to the White House, because while his base is strongly behind him, they're actually not generating that much money for him. He needs more than $1 billion to run his campaign. And both in the other case in New York and this case, and presumably the case coming up in Atlanta, where he's likely to be indicted in August, Republicans are opening their wallets to the tune of a few $1 million. That's a long way from the 1.5 billion that he needs. So I think it's important when we're assessing him in the context of this election to look to the fact that he has lost the popular vote in both elections. He did badly for his party in the 2018 midterms and the 2022 midterms. So we shouldn't confuse him with being a political Goliath at this point.
Jonathan, I think you raised some really good points there, especially when it comes to the independent voters. Amisha, I got to ask, when it comes to this idea of witch hunt, selective prosecution, do you think that's going to resonate, especially after months and months of coverage like we've seen with independent voters come the general elections?
I don't think it's going to resonate with independent voters, but that's not who Donald Trump is speaking to. He is speaking to his base largely, and he's speaking to a growing American population that, quite frankly, is losing a lot of its faith in American institutions. I think that one of the saddest offshoots of Donald Trump's presidency, as well as the post-presidency era, is that he has largely perpetuated this idea that our institutions don't work, this idea that we should not believe or have faith in the institution of democracy, but also our courts. And I think that that has continued to grow throughout his time out of office. He's elevated this concern with the courts and the courts all being against him, that these are basically markedly utilized by the Democrats to attack him. And we knew that this was coming because Donald Trump likes to posit himself as a martyr. It helps him in fundraising. It helps him to remain relevant. He did that during the case that Stormy Daniels brought against him. He did it during the Eugene Carroll case. And now he's utilizing it again and assumably will do the exact same thing when the Georgia case comes. Donald Trump continues to play from the exact same playbook, and it has not diminished him anyway in the polls, if we are to believe those, but it also has not diminished his voice. And I think that, again, one of the strongest things that is quite frankly really sad that this former president has done is increase the level of people, be it whether it is his own supporters or those on the left, the belief that our institutions are problematic and that they don't work for the people. I think that that's a very scary place to be, and that's one thing that this former president, has set America on a trajectory of.
Jonathan, I'd love to get your take on what Amisha just said there. We hear, from the right, all across the board, the weaponization of the Justice Department, right? And justice is based on this idea of trust and blind justice. Legal proceedings aside, do you think that there has been a lot of damage done here?
I do. I think there's been considerable damage, and I think Alicia makes the central point here, which is this is about our institutions. And when you have a former president who is attacking our institutions, saying they are corrupt and that the rule of law doesn't really apply in this country, and that he will, quote, terminate, unquote, the United States Constitution should he be returned to the White House, and that he will use the Department of Justice, talk about weaponizing, for, quote, retribution, unquote, against his political enemies. This does damage to our institutions. I don't think it necessarily does irreparable damage. So our institutions have been damaged in the past. They're pretty resilient. We saw after the 2020 election when 60 judges stepped up to rule against Trump in his false claims that the election had been stolen, that, our institutions can respond firmly. I also think that we shouldn't forget that when we dodge a bullet. So one of my big surprises today was how few people showed up. The Miami police were expecting between 5,000 and 30,000, and there were apparently fewer than 1,000 who showed up. And, when Trump was indicted in New York and when nobody showed up at the courthouse to support him, or virtually nobody, people said, well, that's because it was in New York. Wait till he gets to Florida. Well, they're in Florida, and yes, there was sweltering heat, but the Trump army, which is very loud online, they did not turn out. And so I think the potential for violence that so worries me, violence against our institutions, is maybe a little less today. We still have to worry about these lone wolves who have been given a kind of permission slip by Trump, as some of them have indicated when they've committed violent acts. They cite Trump. We still have to worry about that. But I think the idea of widespread street violence is a little bit less serious tonight than it was before.
And Amisha, Trump is obviously talking a lot on Truth Social. We see his motorcade making its way up there to Bedminster. So he's going to be addressing a crowd you can see there, probably in the couple hundreds. What do you think we're going to hear?
We're going to hear more weaponization of our legal system. We're going to hear that this is basically Joe Biden attacking him. We're going to hear him throw out some barbs against Hunter Biden because he can't get over that, and that he didn't do anything wrong. One thing that Donald Trump does that petulant children do often is refuse to take responsibility for his wrongdoing. We're going to hear that. We're going to hear that this is, again, a witch hunt. And we're also going to hear him talk about why it's so important that he become president again, to be able to fight these systems that aren't working for the people. He is going to try to turn the attention away from all of his illegality to America needing to save him, but also to do a fundraising pitch, quite frankly, because as was stated earlier on in the program, he is nowhere near where he was in 2016 when he was fundraising. He's nowhere near where he was in 2020 when he was fundraising. And he recognizes that, acknowledging that more and more people continue to enter this Republican race, even though he's far and away ahead in the polls. I think that he still knows that even though some people won't attack him outside of Chris Christie, that the reason why a lot of people are entering is because they're hoping that one of these cases is going to knock him out. And he's going to try to showcase his strength, irrespective to the fact that I honestly think he's quaking in his boots at this point.
An historic perspective there. Thanks so very much, Amisha Cross and Jonathan Alter. And turning now to the word we probably are all sick of, but it keeps coming up, the word unprecedented. But exactly what is the history of presidential candidates facing criminal allegations? And what happens if the former president does get convicted? That's where things could get even weirder. Remember, the U.S. Constitution only requires 3 things to run for president. First, you got to be a natural-born citizen of the United States. Second, be at least 35 years old. And third, be a resident of the United States for at least 14 years. And it turns out running for president from jail is not unprecedented, with one possibility on what could happen that took place over a century ago. In 1920, Eugene V. Debs ran for president as the nominee of the Socialist Party while he was in prison for violating the Espionage Act. Now, this was a time when the U.S.'s threshold for what was free speech was very, very, very different than it is today. And after giving this anti-war speech during World War I, Debs was arrested and convicted under that Espionage Act. He was known as convict number 9653, which he proudly used on his campaign items like this pin. And Eugene V. Debs lost, but he still ended up getting nearly 1 million votes, which was almost 3% of the popular vote at the time. Presidential historian Michael Abetschloss joins us now. Michael, does it feel odd that we're talking about Debs and then Trump in the same story because of how radically different we see free speech today?
I think you put it perfectly, Gadi. What happened with Debs, as you know, is that 1918, during World War I, Debs gave a speech to possible people who might be going to fight in World War I and said, you know, resist the draft. This is a war that shouldn't be fought. And under the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act of the time, he was prosecuted, went to jail, ran from jail, and just as you're saying, you're doing great. Got more than 3 million votes from jail as a Socialist Party candidate in 1920. But the thing is, he did not mishandle classified documents or obstruct justice, any of the things that Donald Trump is accused of. But just as you're saying, under our Constitution, Donald Trump can run for office even if he's convicted, can even serve as president from jail.
Are there any charges that would disqualify a candidate to run for president?
Well, the one thing, and it's never happened before, but under the Constitution, after the Civil War, there is an amendment that says that if you supported an insurrection or rebellion, which would certainly be true in the Civil War and might be true legally if you're thinking about what Donald Trump may or may not have done on the 6th of January 2021, I guarantee you that if Donald Trump runs for the office in the fall of 2024, and certainly if he is elected, there will be litigation that says that under that amendment, Trump cannot serve.
So aside from that case, what happens if there's a conviction from one of these other cases against Donald Trump before the elections?
He goes on with his candidacy, and assuming that he's okay under the 14th Amendment, for the first time, sadly, in American history, we could see an American president who is serving from prison.
And we're expecting to hear from the former president tonight in just a few minutes here. This is also going to be his first major fundraiser. A little while ago, you noted on Twitter that as an item for future historians, this is what's going to happen tonight. What are you going to be watching for in that speech and going forward?
Well, what I meant by that, Gadi, is that years from now, if people are going to look at this period and say, what was unusual about this period that we never saw before in American history. You know, with all due respect, yes, he is innocent until proven guilty, but he was the first president today arrested and arraigned for a criminal federal charge that had to do with some pretty big national security infractions if he is guilty. Anyone would have handled this in his or her own way. Donald Trump, as this former reality TV star, has turned this into a reality TV show today. You saw that motorcade that went to the courthouse in Miami. His visit to the restaurant in Little Havana, Miami, the Versailles restaurant, then comes back. This looks more like a reality show than like the sad day of someone being under serious charges who is the front runner of one of the two great parties for president.
Yeah, Michael Beschloss, thank you so much. You know, as journalists, we think we're busy until you talk to a presidential historian. Thanks again.
No, you're doing terrific. You want to be a historian, Gadi? You're perfect tonight. Thank you.
I don't know. I think you're doing a fine job, and that looks like quite a few
both keep
sleepless
our day
nights.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, sir. Be well. Bye-bye.
And we are keeping an eye on Donald Trump's upcoming remarks at Bedminster, but we're going to be right back with a lot more, including 2 officers being disciplined in Kansas. And it all started after a police accused a man of stealing a pizza. That story's next, so stay tuned. Hey there, welcome back. There is a lot of other news happening today that we're keeping an eye on. In Denver, the Nuggets NBA basketball championship victory was marked by a mass shooting close by. 10 victims, including 1 suspect, were hurt. All are expected to survive. Police say it was likely a drug deal that went wrong. And actor Treat Williams has died in a motorcycle crash in Vermont. Williams was known for the musical Hair, Steven Spielberg's 1941, and the TV show Everwood. He was 71 years old. 2 police officers in Kansas have been disciplined after a man was pinned down at Walmart last week. The charge against the man held down has also been dropped, and police originally accused that victim of stealing a pizza. Some good news about the economy. In May, inflation rose 4% from last year, the lowest rate in 2 years, and it's also the 11th straight month that inflation has cooled, with some investors predicting that the Fed could skip an interest rate hike when they meet a little bit later this week. And believe it or not, but the Beatles, yes, those Beatles will release a song later this year. It'll feature vocals from John Lennon? How? Well, all you need is AI. It'll be the first release since the mid-1990s, and Paul McCartney says it'll be their last. And we are learning a lot more about that tanker explosion in Philadelphia that shut down part of Interstate 95. The body that was pulled from the wreckage was identified as tanker driver 53-year-old Nathaniel Moody. Now, Moody was a father and an Army vet. He delivered gasoline to Wawa gas stations across the Philly area. And his family says Moody was very familiar with that I-95 route, as he has been driving trucks for about a decade. Meanwhile, cleanup and construction continues. NBC's Emily Akeda has more.
Hey there, well, the rush to rebuild continues as crews are working around the clock on this critical thoroughfare behind me that was essentially torched to pieces when a gas tanker collided and burst into flames on Sunday morning. What you're seeing behind me, crews on the ground, they're really shifting their attention, focusing on the southbound lanes and demolishing that section because investigators found that section to also be unsound. The Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, on the ground earlier today surveying what will be a massive undertaking. I posed the question to him, what is his level of concern when it comes to the ripple effects from a road closure like this, pointing out how economists today warned that we could see an increase in prices of some goods as a result. He acknowledged that to be the case, saying when trucks have to reroute, drive additional distances, those types of things can be translated into prices, into goods, and that really underscores the importance of rebuilding a critical thoroughfare like this quickly and safely. I talked to a delivery driver who typically drives this stretch of I-95 5 to 10 times a day, so he is really feeling the impact. Take a listen here.
A lot of traffic, extra traffic. If you're going to get somewhere on time, you better leave an hour to 45 minutes earlier than you usually would, or you ain't getting there on time. Every main street from Tarzell Ave, Frankfurt Ave, the Boulevard, all the main streets are blocked up. If you don't know the back roads, good luck.
And we're still waiting for more details on the crash investigation, but family members tell us that the man behind the wheel was Nathaniel Moody, a beloved father and longtime experienced truck driver, and they say he died in the accident on Sunday. In terms of when we could see this interstate completely rebuilt, well, officials say we could learn more details on that timeline tomorrow. Back to you.
Emily Akeda, thanks so much. And tonight, millions of Americans from Texas to the Carolinas are facing the threat of severe storms. Those storms are expected to bring super strong winds and hail. And while one part of Texas is dealing with a severe thunderstorm watch, another part of the state is being threatened by severe heat. NBC's meteorologist Bill Cairns has more.
Gadi, we've had an incredible amount of large hail reported, especially in Texas, and it's not going to stop. It's going to go through the night tonight, and we're going to get new storms tomorrow. They're going to do the same things. This is like 3 days in a row in the same locations dealing with really large hailstones. So you can see the areas of storms. Over Dallas earlier today, we had about 1-inch size hail reported there. That's not enough to do significant damage, but we did have some reports coming in from areas in East Texas and also in areas to the south of Dallas that had up to almost tennis ball size hail. So that's like, pretty much make a fist, and that's the size of the ice chunks that were falling out of the sky. Mostly small hail and a little bit of wind damage with these storms in areas of North Florida. So you see our wind reports. That's the areas in blue. That's where we had wind damage reports, a lot with these. Not so much wind damage, just a little bit here in Northeast Texas, but all the white icons you see there, that's all people that have reported large hail. And you can see it was all those storms that were around the Dallas area and now through East Texas, and then a few here in southern portions of Alabama. And I should mention a few there in North Texas, too, just north of Amarillo. So for the rest of tonight, what are we watching? Well, 18 million people potentially with storms and maybe even severe weather. Some of these people have already experienced the storms, but we'll continue that threat pushing south into North Florida, and we'll still see some isolated strong storms southern Oklahoma and there in North Texas. And that's our best chance of seeing that large hail threat, especially areas north of Amarillo. So for tomorrow, the thing we're going to change tomorrow is that we have a larger area of orange that's enhanced risk, and we may have just enough spin in the atmosphere for isolated tornadoes. And we're mostly going to be focusing in on areas here of eastern Alabama and the southeast section of Georgia. That's the best chance of isolated tornadoes. In all, about 17 million people at risk, including Atlanta and areas there just around Jackson, Mississippi. Large hail. If we don't get the tornadoes, the hail will be the big story. And we could see large hail with any of these storms as we go throughout tomorrow afternoon. The other story, rainfall. You get 3 days in a row of thunderstorms in the same spot. Of course, we're going to get the chance for some flash flooding locally up to 5 inches. And that's those storms that'll be tracking from Montgomery towards Albany, Georgia as we go throughout tomorrow night. And then the other story, if you're in South Texas or even Central Texas, it feels like the middle of summer already. Heat alerts are up. It's been hot. It's going to stay hot. And not only is it hot, but it's really humid, too. Heat index values up to 114. So we do have some heat warnings in effect here in areas from Corpus Christi to Encino. Everyone else is under heat advisories, including San Antonio and the Houston area. So how hot is it going to be? San Antonio near 100 tomorrow. Waco 98. Houston 99. And then if you add the humidity in on top of that, that's when you get those heat indices of 110 to about 114. And if anything, it gets even hotter as we go into this weekend. Waco Friday 103, Saturday 102. Look at San Antonio, a pair of 103s on Friday and Saturday. Pretty brutal stuff. And then Del Rio, an outside shot of heading up there near maybe 110. And compare that to the Great Lakes and areas in the Northeast where temperatures are cool. So really, summer's just sitting there baking in South and Central Texas. Gadi.
Hey, welcome back. And let's take a look at the news making headlines around the world tonight. 22 U.S. service members were hurt in a helicopter crash in Syria. Military officials there say that there was no enemy fire during the, quote, mishap, and they're looking into whatever caused it. Now, about 10 service members have been moved to higher care facilities. U.S. forces have been in Syria fighting terrorism. Search and rescue teams are desperately looking for survivors in Nigeria after a boat capsized in the Niger River, killing at least 100 people. Many of them were coming back from an overnight wedding when it sank. And thousands are fleeing their homes in the Philippines because of an active volcano that's spewing red-hot lava and ash. The Mayon volcano, one of the country's most popular tourist spots, is surrounded by mostly poor farming communities, and authorities say people living further away from the volcano should also be ready to evacuate at a moment's notice. And a nightmare of a story out of Ecuador. Bella Montoya's loved ones were gathered at her wake when they started to hear banging noises coming from inside her coffin. It turns out that Bella was still alive. She had suffered a stroke and a heart attack just a few hours before the wake, and that's when a doctor declared her dead. Bella was rushed back to the hospital. She remains in intensive care, and Ecuador's Ministry of Health is looking into how a premature death declaration happened in the first place. And overseas, just as Ukraine's counteroffensive seemed to be picking up some steam, Russia strikes back in a deadly way. And they have killed at least 11 people in a missile attack on a residential building in Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's hometown. NBC's Ralph Sanchez has the story.
Tonight, a Russian missile strike bringing devastation and chaos to President Zelensky's home city of Kryvyi Rih. At least 11 people killed when cruise missiles slammed into this apartment block and other civilian targets, Ukrainian officials say. Their bodies laid out by the playgrounds. Just hours earlier, President Putin, champagne glass in hand, accused Ukraine of targeting residential areas. The attack comes as Ukraine's counteroffensive gains momentum, liberating a string of small villages from Russian control. Near Bakhmut, close quarters combat in trenches and bunkers. 1 week after this dam exploded, water levels alarmingly low around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, raising fears its reactors could overheat. Dmitry Orlov is the exiled mayor of the neighboring city.
How worried are you about a disaster at the nuclear plant?
There are such worries and fears, he says, but we're ready for the worst scenarios. The UN's top nuclear official hoping to shield the plant from fighting nearby.
There is active combat, so we are worrying that there could be, obviously, mathematically, the possibilities of a hit.
A risk growing worse as the fighting intensifies.
And President Putin today saying the only way this war will end is if the West cuts off weapons to Ukraine. The White House going in the opposite direction, announcing a new $300 million military aid package.
And that does it for us tonight. I'm Gadi Schwartz. We'll see you here tomorrow. But until then, stay tuned for more from NBC News Now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.